Fibre, government guidelines are 30 grams a day. We are currently in the UK eating between 16 and 18 grams, which is actually the recommendations for a 5-year-old. We're woefully under eating fibre. When you fill up on fibre, your stomach fills up. These stretch receptors, they are signaled, and they then talk to your brain to tell your appetite to turn off. It's exactly the same mechanism as Wegovy and Ozempic and these weight loss injections, but obviously on a much less efficient scale.
Emma, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's lovely to see you.
Lovely to see you too. I want to kick off our conversation with longevity. What is this fascination that everyone has with living well for longer?
Yeah, it's certainly a buzzword right now, isn't it? Everybody is talking about it. I think when I talk to my clients and, when I'm kind of creating anything on social media, I like to talk about health span rather than lifespan. So I think, everybody wants to live for as long as possible, but I think what we really need to caveat that with is living healthily for as long as possible. And I think perhaps the reason that my kind of echo chamber is so interested, I think, in lifespan or health span or longevity is because we are hitting midlife. And I think our attentions automatically, it's almost like there's a bit of a kind of wake up call, and we start to think about how we want the next bit of our lives to look. And that's that's what I kind of talk to the people that I work with one-to-one about a lot, actually, because I think midlife and menopause, I'm a menopause specialist, particularly, it really kind of throws into relief how you want the kind of the next chapter of your life to look. And that can look many different ways. And I think, particularly when it comes to things like menopause, there's a real kind of doom and gloom type of narrative around it sometimes. So I think it's really nice to kind of spin it on its head and actually start to think about, like I say, how we want to make sure that the next bit of our lives is looking really vital, and really productive and creative. And there's no reason why we can't do that.
It's interesting the negative narrative that you alluded to there, because I think there's very few positive things I've heard about the menopause. And why is that? As you'll have the scientific backing behind it. What is this negative spin on everything?
I think, there's a slight bit of realism, as in it can be pretty hard going for quite a lot of women, if we're being really honest. But I think we do have to kind of point out the fact or highlight the fact that not everybody suffers in menopause, and it does tend to have a kind of finite number of years. And after you become quite often, when you become postmenopausal, actually those symptoms really kind of start to dissipate. And actually lots of women feel a lot more freedom. They actually, if they've taken stock of their health during that kind of transition, actually they can start to feel really quite liberated. And, lots of women are feeling a lot stronger actually than they did when they were in their 20s and 30s, because they have more time to themselves. But yeah, it does have this stigma still, unfortunately. I think we are chipping away at it slowly, but there is still quite a lot of work to be done,
I think there's also a little bit of vagueness, of confusion. The menopause, what is it? How does it manifest? When does it happen? When is it finished? And what are the symptoms throughout that? And obviously, you said it just there, it'll vary from woman to woman. Some will have severe symptoms, some may have less so. But how do you almost define it? What do you look for? Are there any kind of patterns and trends, and in the work you do, the people you work with? Talk me through a bit for people who maybe kind of have this slight confusion, because as women, we're all going through it at some point in our lives. It's not something you can avoid.
Absolutely. Yeah. Nobody swerves it, as I always say. So if we're talking about kind of quote unquote normal, biological, chronological menopause, it tends to, the average age in the UK is around 51. And essentially menopause just means your final, the end of your fertility, the end of your period. So it's what we call a retrospective diagnosis. So after 12 months of not having a menstrual cycle, we look back 12 months previously and say that day, it's literally one day actually, was your menopause. So it is, I mean, not many people know that actually. It's literally one day. But when you're looking back, you can kind of look over those 12 months and say, yeah, I was menopausal for those 12 months. And then after that, you're postmenopausal. But before that, so the time leading up to it is what we call perimenopause or the menopause transition. And actually, for me, that is the most kind of interesting bit actually. And it's also quite often the most problematic bit. And it can last, anything from 5 years, from a few months to anything to, almost a decade. Some women have, been having symptoms for 12 years or so. And I think, that's the bit that we really need to focus on, because I think a lot of women are entering into that time and they're not really prepared. I think prior to this generation, for example, my mum's generation, really didn't talk about it very much. So Gen X, which is, I'm 53, so we kind of went into it, I think, quite blinkered, and quite, it kind of blindsided a lot of us. But with social media and with these kind of, with technology, we're much better now at talking about things. And I think millennials were very good at chipping away, when it came to things, taboos around things like mental health and periods. And so, I think together we are doing a really good job of trying to make sense of this time of life that like you say, every woman will go through. And, I've kind of touched on it already. Not everybody has a really awful time by any stretch, but we have to be kind of realistic about the fact that a lot of women do suffer from, a myriad of symptoms quite often. And what happens throughout that transition, which, like I say, could last up to 12 years, is that those symptoms can kind of morph and evolve. So it isn't like you've got this set of symptoms that you're dealing with. They can quite often ebb and flow.
Yeah, how it would almost be easier if you knew what you were dealing with, but no, not as simple as that. And
Exactly. I mean,
as is the way.
you can, it is worth, I think, talking to your mother and asking her if um if that's available to you, how she experienced her menopause, because quite often there will be, particularly about when it comes to the timings, there can be a kind of correlation between, when you will go through it, and when she did. And I think it's really worth talking to your, if you've got older women in your family, definitely worth trying to get a steer of what they went through and how they, what's the word, brain fog is a really big symptom, how they navigated it, and the symptoms are massive. So we have estrogen receptors essentially throughout our bodies, and so what happens is when those hormone levels decline, you can feel the effects literally from the follicles in your hair right down to the small bones in your ankles, for example. But there are some kind of really common symptoms. So things like brain fog, things like weight gain, which is something that I talk about quite a lot. Hot flushes are those kind of poster symptoms that everybody talks about. But interestingly, only about 75% of women actually experience them. I think the more kind of insidious symptoms tend to be the psychological ones. So things like a loss of joy. Lots of women will say they simply don't feel like themselves anymore. They've kind of lost motivation. They don't feel like themselves. They've lost a sense of purpose. Lots of women will say that they're lacking in confidence. Many women are kind of reaching the peak of their careers around this time, around midlife, but suddenly they can't stand up in a boardroom or make a presentation. Lots of women will say that they feel really anxious, that they're worried even about getting in the car and driving on a motorway. there's hair loss, there's skin changes. Really, the extent of those symptoms is really, really quite wide.
The mental side of things, as with anything, it is invisible to an extent. You do feel alone and isolated to an extent as well. And with the conversation opening up about menopause, I think a lot of it probably is a discussion on physical symptoms, maybe more so the mental side of it as well. But how can women kind of gain support of that? There's endless products, and I want to talk to you in a bit about, the industry, the menopausal industry. As with any health industry, it can be a bit murky in certain areas and quite exploitive in some areas as well. But the mental side of it, how can women deal with that? The loss of confidence, because I don't think it's something that is majorly obvious. You don't suddenly think, well, this is a menopause, that's why I'm not confident. Because if you're in that lack of confidence, you don't almost have the, not ability is the wrong word, but you don't come to the conclusion of, well, actually it's something else.
Yeah, it can be really hard actually to untangle what is just getting older, what is just being kind of bogged down with teenage kids or young kids, what is work, what is divorce, grief. Invariably, when we're going through this time of life, we are juggling a lot. So yeah, it's incredibly hard. I think one of the most important things, we talk about HRT, so which is hormone replacement therapy. We talk about nutrition, quite a lot. We talk about lifestyle measures, but actually one of the most important things I think at this time of life is for women to reach out to each other and to get that kind of community and that support from each other. I think that really doesn't get talked about enough. And I also think that there is quite a big need almost for therapy around this time, if that is available to somebody. I know it isn't available to everybody. It's expensive. If you can't afford to seek out therapy, getting that therapy from your community, from your support, from your family, and from your friends is incredibly important. And actually, I have a menopause kind of community myself called the M Collective, and one of the most I talk, I upload lots of kind of educational content, but actually I think the thing that most people find the most useful out of that is the fact that they can talk to each other and kind of commiserate and vent and swap ideas and just have that feeling of you're not going through this on your own.
It's funny, it's not necessarily feeling like you need to have the answer, it's just feeling listened to, it's feeling acknowledged, validated. It can be that simple, which is kind of infuriating how simple it can be, yet how effective it is, isn't
Yeah,
it?
and I think often what's happening is because sometimes GPs don't have the training that is needed, because it can be quite a complex topic. Sometimes women aren't being validated when they go and see their GPs. And so, yeah, it kind of sets off this cycle, like you say, of feeling quite isolated and feeling like you've kind of got to just suck it up and get on with it. But I really, for anybody listening, I just really want to get it out there that you are not on your own and that there are a myriad of different approaches and different options out there. There is lots of medical interventions that you can use, so things like HRT, but there's also lots of non-hormone based interventions that are available. And I don't think lots of women know that, because not everybody wants to use hormones, not everybody can, but there are lots of other pharmacological preparations that women can use. So don't give up. I think if you don't get the answers that you need first off from the medical kind of side of things, make sure it can be very hard when you're feeling kind of bogged down by symptoms, but really try, I think, to kind of advocate for yourself and get a second opinion if you're not getting the help that you want to first off.
And you alluded to the lifestyle measures, which I'm quite interested in what you would define those, how you would kind of have that framework of what is a healthy lifestyle, what is wellness, where does it fit in, what's realistic as well.
Yeah, exactly. We've got to keep it realistic, right? I'm big on that, because I think when anything comes up with the wellness attached to it, it can start to get a little bit woo woo and a little bit kind of, there's all this stuff on social media about getting up at 5 and doing all these things, before you start your day. I think there is a lot of, yeah, women are pulled in a lot of different directions at this time of life, and they are extremely time poor. We are, I know from talking to my clients that they are extremely they're overwhelmed by the amount of kind of information that they are bombarded with when they open up Instagram or TikTok or anything really. And even headlines in the news often are conflicting, aren't they? They are often very confusing. That on a different day you will have be told different things. So I think keep it simple is my number one rule. But try and pull the big levers. So the big levers are things like, and your listeners will have heard this 1,000 times. They will probably be eye rolling when I
It
say
is
this.
good to hear it more. We can never hear it enough.
The thing is, you hear it, but you're not. I think people aren't necessarily doing it.
I know.
So it is things like eating a Mediterranean diet, anti-inflammatory, lots of color, lots of polyphenols, these antioxidants. It is increasing the amount of protein in your diet, really, really important. Lots of us, we're not deficient in protein by any stretch, but we're not optimal. And I think by kind of increasing even just a little bit, it can have huge impacts on your, if you are trying to lose a little bit of body fat, for example. It can have big impacts on your mood, on your energy levels. So protein is a drum that I'm banging constantly, and I'm happy to go into this in more detail. But I think as well, fiber, the government guidelines are 30 grams a day. We are currently in the UK eating about between 16 and 18 grams, which is actually the recommendations for a 5-year-old. So we're woefully under eating fiber. It helps to fill us up. When you fill up on fiber, your stomach fills up. These stretch receptors are kind of they are signaled, and they then talk to your brain to tell your appetite to turn off. It's exactly the same mechanism as Wegovy and Ozempic and these weight loss injections, but obviously on a much less efficient scale. But still, it's available to everyone. It's not really expensive. It doesn't have, crazy side effects. So eating more fiber is so important. We need to be thinking about calcium. So bone health is a huge issue for women, particularly post-menopausally. So we need to make sure that we are eating protein, we are getting enough vitamin D, we are consuming enough calcium. So all of these things are really important for bones. Omega-3s are really, really important. They are anti-inflammatory, and we know that when we start to lose our estrogen actually has this kind of nice buffering effect. And actually, when we start to lose it, our bodies can become slightly more pro-inflammatory. So omega-3s from oily fish are really important, but I recognize that not everybody likes oily fish. So, you can supplement. There's a really good vegan supplement, which is called algae oil. So that's an alternative if you're not having your 2 portions of oily fish a week, which I know lots of us aren't. And then my other one that I think is worth talking about is trying to include more phytoestrogens in your diet. So these are these kind of these plant chemicals that we find, particularly in things like soya foods and also things like chickpeas and linseeds, or flax seeds, they're sometimes called. So they have a kind of low level estrogenic effect, but they're it's very weak. It's not going to affect your systemic levels of estrogen, but it can do for some women, not all of them, but it can help with things like hot flushes and night sweats. So they're definitely worth incorporating into your diet. Even if they don't work, they're good because they are, they're a good source of protein, and they are also good sources of fiber. So those are the kind of nutrition levers, I would say. And then in terms of lifestyle, again, it's the boring basics: prioritizing sleep, trying to manage your stress, community support, which we've already touched on. And what would be the other ones? Moving your body in a way that feels good. But if that can possibly incorporate a bit of resistance training, then all the better, because we really start to lose muscle mass around this time. So we really want to beef up, try and mitigate that muscle loss, because muscle is important for so many things.
Do you think that there's more stress now than perhaps there has been previously in
Yeah,
society?
absolutely. Yeah, 100%.
Because it's interesting, isn't it? We have washing machines, we have dishwashers, we have, these machines that cut our lawn without us even having to be outside. We have all of these things, people to do everything for us if we so want. Yet we're all stressed. What do we do with this free time? These labor saving devices. And okay, now I have this chunk of time. What do we do with that? Why are we feeling stressed? What is this stress coming from? What's your views on it?
Oh, I mean, it's such a good question. I mean, the world is in a horrific place right now. I think, the news is always pretty negative. I think we have instant access to all this information as well, which can feel really overwhelming. There's no kind of blissful ignorance anymore, is there? We have to really kind of actively seek out not to kind of be privy to the headlines at the moment.
I think
Uh,
that's a big point of it because it's not that the world's worse, we just know more. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, exactly. And I also think that we're feeling stretched, like I said already, and when your cortisol is high, your sex hormones, particularly, so estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, tend to be low, because obviously you're in this kind of fight or flight state. So it's almost like a vicious circle, I think.
Yeah. And the overwhelm, the panic, then the lack of feeling like, you can escape this kind of circle. You talked about the vicious cycle of it. And it is just that suddenly, hold on, okay, you stop, you speak to a friend, and it doesn't go away, but it just gives you that slight moment of sanity. And incorporating those in along with, the nutrition points as well. I love the pointers that are natural as well. Okay, let's add some chickpeas into our diet and see what happens. And it's not that, as there's so many options that have a lot of side effects, or you don't really know, or you learn about the side effects because it's just been released after you've been taking it for however long, and that sort of thing. The natural points are such a great starting point as well, but often it's not the quick fixes that we may so desire, or the label that says exactly what it's going to do. And I think the whole kind of fad diet culture and the diet pill culture, so to speak, has really kind of spread through a lot of our lives. The diet pill quick fix for everything, that immediate gratification that we do not want to wait. We don't want to wait to save to book a holiday. We'll just pay for it or book it right now and worry about it later. Or I want Amazon, I want it delivered today, never mind tomorrow. Or, I want to learn about that. I'm just going to Google it right now. I don't care them at the table. I can have my phone out at the table. Even these little things. There's no like we haven't really used that muscle for waiting, have we? So then to think, okay, you might just need to suffer this out for a bit, or you need to try this and see how it goes. But it's actually a can of chickpeas rather than a lovely pink diet pill or whatever, or this lovely packaging which looks beautiful. It's funny, isn't it? That kind of when we break it down, I think probably a lot of people are rolling their eyes right now because we all relate to it.
I think that will resonate with lots of people. The Amazon effect is very real, isn't it? And I think social media is so compelling. People are very clever at spinning, these kind of supplements that are going to change your life. And, it is very, I mean, I have to really try hard myself sometimes not to kind of be fooled by it. We touched on it right at the beginning. There's this real push towards kind of meno-washing, So what's happening is there are shampoos and conditioners and skin cream and supplements, and literally you slap the word meno on the label and then you kind of charge 3 times as much. And I think what's happening is because women are so vulnerable and they are feeling quite often ostracized, maybe they're not being listened to by their GP, they are very they're susceptible to this kind of marketing ploy, unfortunately. I think also, just to touch back on what you mentioned just now, lots of women will start to see changes in their bodies and they start to kind of almost panic, and so they want to that they see these changes in their body composition particularly, and then the immediate reaction is to overtrain and to undereat. And that kind of again causes this vicious cycle whereby, they are really restricting themselves, they're depriving themselves of energy, they're not nourishing their bodies. And really at this time, more than any other time in your life, I think, maybe other than pregnancy, we really want to be nourishing our bodies as much as possible. So yeah, they're overtraining, undereating. They might be relying on things like alcohol, and all of these things obviously are stressful in themselves. But what I try to do is to kind of really strip everything back and get women back to basics. And it's almost like kind of retraining the narrative so that they don't have this 6-week body blitz in mind. If anybody is looking for any kind of health overhaul, really we want to be thinking 6 months to a year. You might not notice the changes kind of externally straight away, but even within, and I say this in my new book actually, within a day your microbiome can start to change. Within a week you might see changes within your cholesterol. Within a couple of weeks your metabolic markers will start to improve. So things are happening. You've kind of just got to trust the process and keep showing up.
What is the reaction when maybe someone who feels like they're putting on weight and they're therefore restricting their diet, training a lot, just like the example you gave? What is the reaction when perhaps you suggest eating more, however, with more protein and more fiber and so on? But I think, I'm completely with you, but I'm just thinking of this hypothetical person who'll go, hold on, Emma, I get that, but I'm not going to eat more because that means I'm just going to put on more weight and I'm going to feel worse. And then I'm going to have to train more and then I'm going to eat less and then it's going to be even worse. What's the reaction to that?
Yeah, I mean, I hear that a lot, and people can't believe the size of some of my recipes. They're like, this is I thought this was a serving for one person, but it can't be. And I'm like, it absolutely is. So my ethos is very much big, satiating portions, meals, but not snacking in between. Ideally, this doesn't work for everybody. And yeah, I have to retrain people's minds. It's kind of they have to be kind of, factory. They need like a factory reset because they're so used to depriving and trying to eat as little as possible, but it doesn't get you anywhere.
Do you think that obviously the women who you'll be working with who are going through the menopause now will have grown up without social media? And therefore they wouldn't have had all the Instagram reels and whatever it is and a lot more access to this, immediate health and fitness tips and whatever. Do you think that the narrative is kind of changing on health in terms of restrictive diets, eating less, how we train? So when you like it's hard to predict, but I guess when, the people who are say in their 20s or 30s now go through the menopause, do you think that the approach will be slightly different?
Yes, I think it will be markedly different. I think millennials who are now entering into possibly perimenopause, they are in a very different place to Gen X when we did. I think we came into it, like I said, blind. I think millennials are coming into it having, menopause is talked about so much more, right? It's in the headlines pretty much daily. And I think, yeah, that they've got this kind of wealth of knowledge that they can access. And I think it will be very, very hopefully different for them. And, I wrote my first book is called The Perimenopause Solution. And actually the premise that, in the proposal, when I came up with the idea, it was to help younger women so that they didn't feel like they were blindsided and kind of falling off a cliff. So it was all about preparing them so that they were, they went into it with kind of eyes wide open. And I think, yeah, that is happening for lots of different reasons. Books, podcasts, there's a wealth of information, but there's also lots of celebrities brilliantly talking about their own experiences too, which I think has helped, enormously.
And going back to the nutrition side of it, you mentioned this certain number quite often, which is a 30. And if only someone was to put it all together into a format that we could understand. And obviously, I'm referring here to your book, The 30 Gram Plan. How can it be so simple? You've listed off a lot of different things in terms of nutrition, which I think can feel quite overwhelming, even though, they're quite well explained by you just there. And yet there's a book that has these recipes that has it all in it. That almost seems too good to be true. Can you kind of tell me a bit about the background of it and how you've kind of simplified this maze of information into actual recipes that we can buy the ingredients in a supermarket?
What a brilliant segue, Emily. Thank you.
Not my first
Um,
podcast.
so yeah, the 30 gram plan is my new book, which is out May the 1st. And essentially, my clients were coming to me and saying, look, just tell me what to eat. I haven't got the time to think it all through. I just want it all laid out for me. So I created a 2-week online plan, which I kind of coached them through, and I came up with a meal planner with recipes. And it was over 1,000 people signed up for it. It was so successful, and the feedback was so extraordinary that actually I was approached to turn it into a book. And so that is the book that is imminently about to launch. And essentially that's what I've done. I'm kind of spelling it out, and I've taken the research and translated it essentially into food that people want to eat. So it's nothing fancy. It's really straightforward. There's lots of batch cooking, lots of meal prep ideas in there, but it takes the latest research, which is 30 grams of protein per meal, 30 grams of fiber a day, and 30 different plants a week. And I've just, melded it together, and put it into meal plans, so that women and men, it's open to everybody, can follow it, and it almost gives them like a kind of a blueprint, like a framework, and they can adapt that and personalize it as they see fit.
And what's your favorite recipe in it?
That's such a good question. There is an amazing harissa chickpea recipe in there with crispy salmon, which I absolutely love. The harissa is just kind of really elevates it, but it's so simple, full of fiber, really filling, really tasty. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to create food that was really quick to put together, no kind of exotic ingredients, and that you look forward to eating. Because I think when it comes to healthy food, lots of people are thinking kind of kale and I don't know, broccoli and things like that. But yeah, there's a wealth of recipes in there. There's vegan, veggie, and flexitarian options, and I'm really hoping that people love it as much as they did when they went through the online version of it.
I think it's quite interesting when you have, a book, a lovely book with lovely recipes in it, because it creates a bit of a moment. Not only are you kind of scrolling frantically through websites and whatever and trying to get enough food in, and you run to the shops and that sort of thing. I had a really interesting conversation with Dr. Emily Piper. She was telling me about how you can eat a really healthy meal, a lovely, tasty, tasty meal one day. You can eat the exact same meal the next day. But if you've had, it'll be going back to cortisol levels. If your cortisol levels are high and you're rushing about and, you're not in the right mindset for it, it can make you bloat. It can make you feel terrible. It can have a complete opposite effect, even though it was the same meal. So I think that the approach to it as well, we probably have an evening routine so that we sleep well, right? We talk about that, whether you're into, your lavender sprayer, your eye mask, or even if you just sit, like turn your phone off an hour before bed. That we understand that. But the approach to food as well is quite an interesting one. Do you actually sit down at a table without a screen that you're looking at? Do you sit down with someone and share company with? If you talk, then maybe you're going to actually slow down and actually not eat as fast, which means you'll digest it more. And I'm just kind of throwing out examples here. But it's quite interesting, kind of the approach to eating and how that should be some sort of like a sacred routine as well, which you want to make it realistic. You want to make it sustainable. I mean, this is literally what we've been talking about. You don't want to say I need to sit down with my white tablecloths and, my silver cutlery and go on. That's not something that's going to be very easy to do every day. But what's your thoughts on that, kind of the approach to the good food as well?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I try and get my clients, we talk about one mindful meal a day. You can't do every meal, but yeah, one for at least one meal, make sure you are sitting, savoring it, taking your time. And even if you are, eating at work, whilst, I don't know, looking at a spreadsheet. Unfortunately, sometimes that's just the reality, right? I think it's really important to just stop, do some 3 deep belly breaths before you actually pick up your knife and fork. All of these things can help. Even just having a quick kind of walk around the block afterwards. There's lots of talk at the moment. I don't know if you've seen this on social media about fart walks after dinner.
Gosh.
I know. So but it's simple. It's just a 10-minute walk after dinner, rather than, I think, we are all very prone to finishing a dinner and then kind of collapsing onto the sofa and embarking on a huge kind of Netflix binge. It's just kind of changing up our habits, but these are tiny tweaks. We're not overhauling by any stretch. And you're right. What you eat and how you're feeling really determines how you digest and things like that. Which is why lots of people are wearing these CGMs when they don't really need to, and it's kind of almost a little bit redundant, because your CGM reading will differ. You should have exactly the same food for 3 days on the trot, but actually your CGM reading will differ depending on what you've eaten before, how you've slept, your stress levels. So actually, this kind of leads on to something that I wanted to talk about. I think at this time it's really important to carry out a kind of like a health audit. I think this is a really good time to kind of take stock. We touched on it right at the top, didn't we? About taking stock of your health, so that you do go into your post menopause life really kind of strong and vital, and kind of feeling as good and as healthy and as robust as you possibly can. So I often tell my clients, even before I start working with them, to ideally with their GP, just get a baseline blood panel done. So they are getting their iron levels done, their B12, their vitamin D, their folate, their cholesterol, their thyroid, and their HbA1c, which is your measurement of your blood glucose levels over the last 90 days. And, this is all relatively easy to access. I say that obviously knowing that it can be at the moment quite hard to get in to see your GP. But if you haven't had a blood test done recently, you've got a very good argument, if you're a midlife woman, to ask for this kind of baseline blood panel. And what it will do is, quite often it will throw up, the any kind of suboptimal numbers, which I think can be really important to sort out, irrespective of menopause symptoms, because a lot of those, if you are kind of low in iron, if your thyroid isn't functioning 100%, a lot of those symptoms actually do mimic those of menopause, perimenopause. So, it can be a really nice, quick, easy fix.
Do you think, kind of going into the symptoms that, a lot of women can experience, that you said, in the mental side of things, so maybe lack of confidence or, spikes of anxiety, that there's a bit of a fear of, oh, I don't want to get that blood test done because what's it going to tell me? I don't want to, speak to a therapist, or, even go to a nutritionist expert like yourself. I don't want to do that because I'm scared. I have this fear of what is going to be said, or, and you're projecting all of these, perhaps unrealistic or perhaps very dramatic and catastrophizing outcomes in that kind of space.
Yeah, there's a real trend, isn't there, at the moment, for kind of like biohacking, kind of, kind of almost over analyzing certain markers. But what I'm talking about here is really pretty straightforward. It's not going in for a full MRI scan, which is again this kind of trendy thing that's happening at the moment, which I think can kind of throw up a lot of false positives and kind of almost bring about a lot of anxiety. And I think you're right, there is a lot of the worried well at the moment. Lots of people almost kind of hyperfixating on every tiny little niggle and every kind of fluctuation in their readings, if they've got aura rings, or, like I said, like those continuous glucose monitors. So yeah, we do. I really, we need to kind of keep it realistic. So yeah, yeah, try and go into it with a kind of sensible mind. And I think also curate your Instagram, your social media feed, because there is
Mhm.
a lot of neuroses on there. If anybody is making you feel weird or anxious around the food that you're eating, honestly, mute them, unfollow them. It's just it's not good for your mental health.
Very, very true, exactly. A little audit never does anyone any harm.
And
Um,
nobody needs to know, right?
exactly, exactly, which is even better. And you mentioned kind of at the start, we keep referring about we've so much going on, um, that about kind of the stages of life of that, women will go through. Maybe they'll kind of tune into health a wee bit more as they kind of go towards menopause, and maybe they have more symptoms. Maybe you could give kind of an example from your own experience, your own life of like the approach to health and how that can change. What is the stages of life and the approach to health? How does that change kind of as we age?
Yeah, I think we become a lot more intuitive for sure. I think, when you hit midlife, you definitely aren't as resilient as you used to be. And the things that you used to get away with, for me, which was, drinking, staying up all night, really not prioritizing sleep at all, those things really do start to kind of catch up on you. Um, that's not to say you can't pull an all-nighter every now and again, but it's definitely not a kind of weekly event. So yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for kind of listening to your body, really tuning in. It's your body is incredibly smart, and but the problem is, I think we're so busy that we are often kind of got our hands over our ears, and we're not really kind of listening to what it's trying to tell us. So yeah, I have really had a kind of quite an overhaul in terms of. So I used to work in advertising. Life was really frenetic, lots of partying. And I actually retrained after I got made redundant when I was in my late 30s. So I started nutrition kind of from, it took me 3 years to retrain. So from my kind of early 40s onwards. And, I haven't looked back, but I am certainly not perfect by any stretch. And I think anybody listening to this who thinks, oh my God, I've got to kind of overhaul this and I'm not allowed to eat crisps and I've got to eat all these plants and, you haven't got to do everything. It's a guide. It's not the law. This is what I'm always telling people. Just make these small tweaks, make them work for you, bed them in, bed in one or two things that you really want to kind of prioritize. When they start to feel natural and normal, then you can start to kind of expand on them. But yeah, I'm talking, perfectly imperfect diets here.
Yeah, exactly. And it is just that example of, if we had 5% of our day kind of go away, we're not going to write off the whole day. So if we, make a few, well, I'd even be careful using the word mistakes, but errors or, misjudgments in our diet, we're not going to suddenly think, well, I'm just going to finish the day off with loads of chocolate and alcohol or whatever you want to indulge in.
I know the analogy I always use is if you've got a puncture a puncture in your tire, you're not going to go around and kind of puncture the other three, right? It's like you pick yourself up. Easter is the perfect example. People have probably been indulging. We've just had a long weekend, lots of chocolate. It doesn't matter. What you eat over one weekend really is neither here nor there. It's what you do the majority of the time that counts. And I think what tends to happen is that people are in that kind of, they can be in a little bit of a like sod it mentality, whereby they've been on holiday, they've kind of overindulged and they think, oh, well, that's it now. I might as well just carry on. For a lot of my coaching actually revolves around getting people to to kind of pick themselves up and literally just get back into their back into the saddle, so to speak.
Exactly. And what is, to close off, one of the best pieces of advice you've been given? What springs to mind?
Oh my God. um Apart from doing this health audit, because I think that's really important. I think there are lots of women walking around, with particularly with low iron levels, and it can make you feel incredibly fatigued. And I think once you get your iron levels kind of more optimized, it has such huge effects on things like skin, hair, sleep. You know, lots of people, women will notice that they've got restless legs. It's nothing to do with hormones. It's because their iron levels are really low. But yeah, the other thing, I think probably the most important thing is to say no more, you know, to have boundaries, not to kind of spread yourself quite so thin, because it just doesn't really benefit anybody at the end of the day. It can be really hard, but once you start saying no more, it can be really quite liberating.
Exactly, yeah. That is a very good piece of advice. Because if you just spread yourself thinly, as you say, it's no use to anyone, including yourself, and it's just not a good time. So
Yeah.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining, Emma. And if people want to follow you online and check out your new book and all sorts of things, where should they go? What should they do?
Yeah, so the 30 gram plan is out May the 1st. Like I said, you can get it from all good bookshops and online. Um, I mostly hang out on social media at emma.bardwell. There's lots of no nonsense kind of health tips, tricks, hacks, dare I say it? Hate the word hack, but and lots of recipes over there. And I'm always, my DMs are always open if anybody's got any questions for me.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.